Okay, so we've looked at approximants and we've looked at fricatives. Now let's dig into some more types of sounds. And we're going to start with the plosives. Now, plosives articulatorily are formed by a complete closure followed by a release. And acoustically, the acoustics correspond very closely to that. So here's a waveform of a pa. And this is actually aspirated. And we can see the nice regular repetitions, vocal cycles for ah on either side. And then in the middle, first we get, after the first ah, we get a bit of silence. That's the closure portion. And then that's immediately followed by this brief spike up and down. That's an impulse. That's the burst caused by the release of that closure. And then in this case, we also have a little bit of aspiration following that. Okay, so that's what it looks like in a waveform. Now, if we look in the spectrogram, we actually have the same thing. Following the ah, we have closure, which is largely silence. We just have the background noise here. Then we have this. Sometimes it's not as apparent in a spectrogram, but here we have a kind of a vertical pulse. That's the impulse, the release burst. And then we have that bit of aspiration and then the rest of the sound. Okay. So that's what you see with a plosive. Now we can also compare, here's a voiceless plosive, the one we just saw, and on the right is a voice plosive. It's very similar, except we also have this voicing bar right at the bottom during that closure. So silence except for the voicing bar. Okay. So that's the brief anatomy of what a plosive looks like acoustically. And if we compare different plosives, they actually look very similar. So we have a pa, a ta, and a ka here. They all have that silence. They all have that burst. The bursts look a little differently because they have different concentrations of energy in them. And the other thing that you can begin to notice here with a pa, the formants, they're actually diving down a little bit just as you go into that silent portion. With a ta, F2 is coming up, F3 is coming up a little bit, and with a ka, F3 is coming down and F2 is coming up. You're getting a little bit, and you see the same on the other side, a little bit of that, what's called the velar pinch. So it can be really tough to find, and sometimes it's really not very apparent from the spectrogram that we have available, but those formant transitions really are a good cue to place of articulation. Okay, so for plosives, we have the very distinctive shape of them acoustically with the silence portion, the burst, and then sometimes a bit of aspiration afterwards. And then we can distinguish them based on the energy in the burst, which is discussed in the textbook, and those formant transitions. All right, well, let's move on to another class of sounds, the nasal stops. So, nasal consonants, there's a lot of stuff going on here. There is a sense where they're just resonances in a tube, like vowels and approximants, but of course, the tube looks a lot different. It's longer because it reaches up and through the nasal passage rather than just through the oral passage. And it branches, right? There's that dead end in the oral passage that stops wherever the closure is, right? Nasal stops means there's a stop. There's a complete obstruction of airflow through the mouth. But there's that kind of side branch, dead ending that participates acoustically. So the long tube means that nasals have a very low frequency nasal formant, sometimes called the nasal murmur. And the branching does various things. One of the things it does is that it generates antiformants, areas where energy is more actively leached out of the signal. These aren't always very easy to pick out on a spectrum or a spectrogram, but it is a thing that mathematically we know it's got to be there, and with careful examination it can be done. Here's an example of anna. That's the alveolar nasal. And you see it's not just a voicing bar here. There's actually some formant activity going on at the bottom. You see some very faint formants higher up, much fainter than you would find in approximants, for example, but it's more than what you find, for example, in the plosives in their silence portion. Okay. And we can compare different nasal consonants. These faint formants have slightly different positions and structures depending on the place of articulation. In fact, the nasal formant and the antiformant positions will be a little bit different based on the place of articulation as well. Okay. And there's also some things happening with formant transitions that I'm not going to belabor, but the same sorts of patterns that you expect with plosives, you can expect with nasals in terms of formant transitions. Okay, what's left? We have the lateral approximants. Now, lateral approximants look a lot like other approximants. Here's the one alveolar lateral approximant in English. It has less energy. It has distinctive formant structure, stronger than with nasals, but not quite as strong as the vowels around it. Also, because the airflow actually branches with a lateral, you generally have airflow on both sides. There's some branching. You do get an antiformant as with nasals. As with nasals, it can be somewhat tricky to actually identify clearly, but it is there. And different laterals will have slightly different formant structures because that point of branching around is going to be at a different place. So we're going to close the consonants and this video with some stuff on affricates. Now, an affricate, articulatorily, it's a combination of a plosive and a fricative. So acoustically, yes, that's exactly what you get. You get a plosive, you get the silence followed by a release burst, then you get some fricative noise. If it's voiceless, a cha, then the silence doesn't have a voice bar. If it's voiced like a ja, it does have a voice bar. And one thing you'll notice if you're looking at this in samples of your own speech, the duration of the closure and the duration of the fricative are each shorter than the duration of just a plosive or just a fricative, because an affricate is a single sound and it tends to take up altogether about the same amount of time as a single consonant, a single plosive or a single fricative. So the individual portions are compressed a little bit. And that is affricates. Okay, so in the final video for this section, we'll be looking at sort of summing these things up and then talking about some unresolved issues. Yeah, look forward to that.